The origins of heat. How wrestling's heels were born in real sport during Roman Reigns' historic run as WWE's undisputed champion. Writer and historian Brian Solomon compiled a list of the longest-reigning heel world champions in wrestling history. Making the cut was Ed Strangler Lewis, whose second title reign lasted 1,042 days, from 1922 to 1925. But what caught my attention wasn't Lewis's longevity. Instead, it was that he was considered a heel. At that time, newspapers still covered matches like they were real athletic contests, even as some writers hinted at the sport being fixed. And so I became curious. If wrestling was still seen as a real sport, how was Lewis a heel? My curiosity led me to ask when the heel babyface dynamic developed. I don't think it was really solidified until the 30s, said Solomon. And remember, you didn't have TV back then, so it had to be done in subtle ways. Lewis became organically very unpopular with fans and the press because of his bullying tactics and how he'd beat all the local favorites. I didn't fully grasp what Solomon meant by bullying tactics until I watched a 1950s match featuring the German heel Hans Schmidt. When Schmidt grabbed his opponent's hair, the crowd erupted, shouting "Hair! Hair!" Moments later, he shielded the referee's view as he threw an illegal punch to his opponent's stomach. Mild by today's wrestling standards, Schmidt's antics were like fouls in MMA, such as grabbing the cage or poking an opponent's eyes, which also angers modern fans. This was especially true for Brazilian fighter Rousimar Palhares, one of MMA's most controversial figures. At UFC Fight Night 29 in 2013, Palhares submitted Mike Pierce with a heel hook just 31 seconds into the fight. But he refused to release the hold despite the referee's instructions. The next day, he was released by the UFC for his unsportsmanlike conduct and other previous disciplinary issues. Palhares signed with the World Series of Fighting in 2014, where he won the welterweight title. That December, he submitted John Fitch in just 90 seconds with a knee bar. Once again, he held the submission too long, drawing criticism. In 2015, he defeated Jake Shields by Kimura in the third round. But the bout was marred by eye gouges and another delayed release of a submission hold. As a result, he was stripped of his title and suspended for 2 years by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Despite his talent, Palhares' unprofessional behavior made him a pariah among fighters, fans, and promoters. His actions threatened to undermine the legitimacy of MMA. Though he continued fighting, promotions like the UFC never took another chance on him. Still, the visceral reaction Palhares provoked in real fights mirrored how early wrestling heels like Schmidt and even Lewis were received. Their actions violated the audience's sense of fair play. That violation was the seed of heat. While leagues like the UFC and WSOF distanced themselves from Palhares, pro wrestling leaned into such villains, allowing rule-breakers to flourish. That laid the foundation for the genre's long-standing tradition of heels and babyfaces. It was very organic, said Solomon. They couldn't be too over-the-top back then because that would be considered exposing the business. The general public was still pretty in the dark. But even the idea of a heelish world champ turned off a lot of the more sophisticated sports fans. That organic disdain for certain wrestlers created the earliest distinctions between heroes and villains. Before there were flashy promos and scripted betrayals, simply skirting the rules was enough to make one a bad guy, as hitting an opponent on a break, pulling hair, and stalling were heavily frowned upon. Over time, those patterns became tropes. Indeed, those early theatrics alienated some viewers. As a result, wrestling's credibility as a legitimate sport continued to erode faster than a receding hairline. Still others embraced the spectacle, hungry to see villains punished. That craving for justice helped shape the classic wrestling story that still hooks fans today, the timeless battle between good and evil babyfaces and heels.